What if I told you there was a Dragon Ball story you didn't even know existed? Not as a manga, not as an anime, but in the most unexpected way as a MMORPG. I was also surprised when I found out, but I guess at one point in time, everyone was making some form of MMORPG, and Dragon Ball was no different. Actually, if you think about it, the world of Dragon Ball does lend itself to be a solid foundation for MMORPG, with its massive world. Like, think about it. The Dragon Ball universe is uniquely suited for a massive open world game due to its diverse biomes, like the living world, the afterlife, and the demon realm. The living world, specifically Earth, allows for a wide variety of environments such as the Wasteland's metropolitan hubs, the sacred Korin Forest, and the tropical Papaya Island. Each of these areas are already established in the lore of Dragon Ball, with specific cultural and physical characteristics that translate effortlessly into a MMORPG. And that's not even including planets like Namek and Planet Vegeta. Furthermore, the afterlife consisting of the Serpent Road and Hell, creating near infinite potential for a universe that players could explore. And let's not forget the different races: Saiyans, humans, Namekians, Magians, and so many more that came way after this game was released. And I guess eventually, someone decided to make a Dragon Ball MMORPG. Back in 2003, NTL Incorporated, a collective group with operations in both South Korea and Japan, wanted to create a persistent virtual world that could sustain the legacy of Akira Toriyama's universe while introducing new narrative layers that moved beyond the original Z Fighters. The commercial framework of Dragon Ball Online was a collaborative effort involving multiple regional publishers and development partners. The title was published by Bandai Namco Entertainment in Japan, while regional operations were handled by CJ Internet Corporation in South Korea and Kaian Tech in Taiwan and Hong Kong. The development cycle was lengthy and marked by several high-profile delays, with the first major beta testing phase announced for South Korea in 2007, before eventually officially launching in early 2010. This release schedule established a specific regional footprint for the game that defined its legacy as an Eastern exclusive for much of its lifespan. The design philosophy, led by director Koji Takamiya, aimed to move away from the traditional fighting game structure that had dominated Dragon Ball video games for decades at that time, opting instead for a thoughtful experience centered on world exploration, character progression, and social interaction. So what we now consider as a typical MMORPG. But you know what's the craziest part in all of this to me? Was that Dragon Ball's creator, Akira Toriyama, actually helped create this world and story. He wasn't a part of it as a mere consultant or a distant figurehead. His involvement was extensive and spanned for a majority of the years prior to the game's launch. Toriyama's supervision extended to the minute details of character design, environmental aesthetics, and the historical timeline that would carry the series forward into the next millennium. He was required to sign off on every aspect of the game to ensure an authentic Dragon Ball universe feel, ranging from the design of new playable races to the specific implementation of iconic techniques. To understand why Dragon Ball Online is fundamentally different from other non-manga projects like Dragon Ball GT or the majority of the theatrical films, we need to look back at the depth of Toriyama's direct involvement. Historically, Toriyama maintained a hands-off approach to animated fillers and movie scripts, often contributing only basic character designs or initial premises before allowing the studio to handle the narrative execution. In contrast, Toriyama spent 5 years prior to 2008 working specifically on the character designs. location arrangements, and overarching lore of Dragon Ball Online. This period of intense creative output ensured that the game's world adhered strictly to the aesthetic and philosophical principles of the original manga rather than the anime's often divergent interpretations. This commitment to the Dragon Ball universe resulted in specific visual and structural choices that distinguish the Age 1000 timeline. In Dragon Ball Online, Future Trunks retains his original purple hair from the manga. This level of detail suggests that Toriyama viewed Dragon Ball Online as a legitimate continuation of the manga's specific continuity, effectively bypassing the filler-heavy timelines of the animated series to create a canon-adjacent future that respected the source material's nuances. This level of oversight provided an official touch that was rare for licensed games at that time, effectively positioning Dragon Ball Online as a supervised sequel to the original manga's narrative. This collaborative effort between NTL and Bird Studio, Toriyama's personal production company, sought to unify the technical expertise of South Korean MMO developers with the creative potency of Japanese manga authorship. The result was a world that felt fundamentally connected to the Dragon Ball universe while being untethered enough to allow players to forge their own path as new warriors. The narrative of Dragon Ball Online is set 216 years after the events of the Majin Buu saga, placing the present day of the game in the year Age 1000. This massive time jump was a strategic decision intended to allow the world to evolve technologically and socially, creating an environment where the original Z fighters have moved from active protagonists to historical figures and legends. In this future, the Earth has become a melting pot of species, and the legacy of Son Goku has been institutionalized as a foundational myth for a global martial arts culture. The transition from the peaceful conclusion of the manga to the chaotic events of Age 1000 is documented in the game's chronicle as an official historical outline supervised by Toriyama. This timeline details several critical turning points that transformed Earth into a hub of interstellar and interspecies activity. So, this pretty much proves that Dragon Ball Online is a canonical storyline that continues way after Dragon Ball Z and is an important lore connecting to the Dragon Ball universe. So how did one of the most popular IP in the world have an MMORPG that came and went, yet no one ever speaks about it? Well, despite its prestigious creative pedigree, the game was officially shuttered in late 2013, after only a 3-year operational window in select East Asian markets. This failure was not merely the result of technical deficiencies or geographic isolation, but a combination of structural organizational issues, a hyper-competitive global MMO landscape, and an unfortunate timing in a franchise's broader media lifecycle. The biggest failure of Dragon Ball Online was its inability to reach its full commercial potential, because, unfortunately, it didn't break out of South Korea, Taiwanese, and Hong Kong markets. Think about that. South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. I did not say Japan. Where did Dragon Ball originate from? Japan. For a franchise that had sold over 260 million copies of its manga worldwide and broadcast its anime in more than 80 countries, the lack of Japanese, North American, or European release is the most mind-boggling thing. I get North America and Europe, fine, but how did it not release in Japan? Apparently, the original intent as expressed by director Koji Takemiya was a global rollout. NTL was established with roughly 80 staff members across Japan and Korea, specifically to facilitate this worldwide rollout. However, the project encountered a licensing paradox. While Bandai Namco held primary game rights, the complex web of domestic and international publishing agreements made the logistics of a global MMO launch far more challenging than those of a standard console release. And the failure to launch in Japan is particularly significant. As the primary market for the franchise, a Japanese release would have provided a stable economic base. However, the Japanese gaming market at the time was heavily skewed towards console gaming. The NTL partnership was specifically designed to leverage the Korean PC bang, or internet cafe culture, which emphasized long session grinding and social competition, elements that were not yet as popular in the Japanese mainstream. By the time the localization versions were discussed for Japan and the West, the financial stability of NTL had begun to waver. Reports suggest that the company faced insolvency and eventual bankruptcy before it could finalize the additional content or localizations required for more demanding markets like North America and Europe. This geographical limitation meant that Dragon Ball Online was deprived of the massive revenues it could have generated in the West, where the Dragon Ball Z brand remained the golden goose for publishers like Bandai Namco. And on top of that, the timing of Dragon Ball Online's release coincided with the most competitive era in the history of the MMORPG genre. In 2010, the market was dominated by World of Warcraft, which was at its peak following the release of The Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm expansions. The rising bar, in terms of polish and depth, meant that players were less likely to migrate to a new game unless it offered an experience that was either superior or fundamentally different. Dragon Ball Online unexpectedly found itself competing not only against Blizzard's giant, but also against high-budget Western titles like Star Wars The Old Republic, Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning, and the relaunch of Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. Many of these competitors either failed or were forced to adopt free-to-play models to survive, as the MMO market was starting to fragment. Compounding the pressures from traditional MMOs was a broader shift in player tastes. The early 2010s saw the explosive rise of the multiplayer online battle arena, MOBAs, led by League of Legends and the creative sandbox-style games of Minecraft. These games offered bite-sized, reward-heavy experiences that did not require the same level of persistence or time commitment as a traditional MMO. Korean developers who had traditionally relied on long, grind-centric leveling systems found that Western and even some East Asian audiences were beginning to view these mechanics with distaste. Dragon Ball Online's reliance on mind-numbingly dull grinding, which admittedly is a staple of the South Korean development philosophy of the era, ultimately discouraged long-term engagement from a global audience that was moving towards more dynamic gameplay loops. The cultural context in which Dragon Ball Online operated was one of the most significant, yet often overlooked factors of its failure. The period between 2005 and 2012 is frequently referred to as a weird era for the franchise, mainly because of its lack of new flagship animated content. The original manga had ended its serialization in 1995, and the Dragon Ball GT anime concluded in 1997. While the franchise remained a mammoth in terms of legacy, it lacked the active hype machine of a currently weekly televised series to drive player acquisition. Dragon Ball Online was also launched after the 2009 release of the live-action film Dragon Ball Evolution. I forgot about that. Yeah, that's a rough look, which had a negative impact on the brand's prestige. Unfortunately, Dragon Ball Online release was a mixture of bad timing and lack of resources. By 2013, NTL was reported to have gone bankrupt, leaving the game without a development studio to produce new content or maintain the existing servers. The game had entered a dead spot where the community remained engaged, but the development was non-existent. And then Bandai Namco's management of the Dragon Ball IP during this period was increasingly focused on high-margin, low-maintenance titles. The emergence of Dragon Ball Z Dokkan Battle and the massive success of the Dragon Ball Heroes card game in Japan demonstrated that the company would print cash without the massive overhead and technical risk of an open-world MMO. Although Dragon Ball Online failed as a live service, its creative contribution was not lost. The game's story, characters, and even core assets were retooled in the 2015 title Dragon Ball Xenoverse, which focused on the core narrative of the Time Patrol, a group led by Future Trunks to stop the Time Breakers from altering the timeline, which was created specifically for Dragon Ball Online. Mira and Towa, the main villains of Dragon Ball Online, were co-created by Akira Toriyama and have since become iconic figures in the broader franchise, appearing in Dragon Ball Heroes, Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, and the Xenoverse series. The transition from a WoW-style MMO to a lobby-based RPG like Xenoverse addressed the technical fallings of the original project by keeping the high-speed fighting in small self-contained instances while using a centralized city for its social interaction. Bandai Namco was able to deliver the Dragon Ball experience players wanted without the network processing bottleneck that plagued the MMO. Ultimately, Dragon Ball Online was a victim of its own ambition and poor timing. While it failed as a standalone product, its creative DNA and setting, shaped by Toriyama, provided the foundation for the next decade of Dragon Ball interactive media. The pivot to Xenoverse proved that the Time Patrol concept was great because, come on, the dude made Dragon Ball, he know what he's doing. But one that required a more focused modern technical delivery than an MMO could ever provide. And despite the official shutdown in 2013, the Dragon Ball Online community has demonstrated remarkable resilience. Since the servers went dark, several fan-led projects have emerged to preserve the game. These projects involve small groups of developers working to translate the original Korean and Taiwanese client files into English. However, these fan iterations are often stuck in a vanilla state, unable to add significant new content without the resources of a professional studio. The limited exposure of these rogue servers means that the community remains small, further illustrating that without a global official release, the game was doomed to remain a niche memory for all but the most dedicated fans. Do you think Dragon Ball Online would have actually done well in the West? Have you ever played Dragon Ball Online actually? Let me know down in the comments, and please be sure to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.